Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David.
My name's Matt.
And we're coming at you live.
Like we have every week since we started.
So we're never truly live.
But coming at you might be language that makes you feel a little bit stressed or anxious.
Yeah, it's quite aggressive, isn't it? Yeah. And so today we're going to do a book review on a book called A Non-Anxious Presence by Mark Sayers. So we like Mark Sayers. He is a Christian and he's a pastor, and
he lives in Australia.
So
he's Australian.
That's a little bit of his context. He's done quite a lot of other things. This Cultural Moment was quite a well listened to podcast. He's written a couple other books, Reappearing Church, things like that. So this is a Christian book for a Christian context.
Indeed. You preempted my first question, which is who is he? What's the book about?
Yes. So the title says something, A Non-Anxious Presence. And I'm sure, like, you are like us, we've heard lots of people talk about anxiety. People are suffering with anxiety. People have anxious feelings much more often.
Yeah.
But until now, I haven't really felt a compelling reason to understand why that has grown so much, other than maybe something to do with the internet and that sort. And I suppose he helped me frame it. So this book, at some level, is quite high end, like systems, high level systems, high end book. It's got paid good money for it. It's high level systems thinking about how the world functions, and obviously, through most of history, you've understood a nation as a nation. You would be at war with another nation, or you would conquer another nation. And at the end of, or approaching the end of World War II, some people in America got together and they had this radical new idea, which was to not see the world as a collection of nations, but rather as a network, which we all understand networks now.
Yes.
Really, that probably doesn't feel like a new idea to you as I say that. How radical. But actually, that was radical to shift from something that was a nation to with a network. Borders. With borders, with the military, to a network.
To a network which has got nodes and hubs and connections.
Yeah, and so they got together, they came up with a term like the free world, which you've all heard. That was intentionally crafted, which to push their ideas out and really to be this economic growth machine.
Right.
But in a network, you become decentralized.
Yes.
So it went from a nation was a central hub, a capital city was a central hub, or stronghold, to use biblical language. And yet, as it pushed out, it becomes decentralized. And so now we're in this place where there are competing stories and competing central hubs now around the world through this network. And that has brought anxiety through the network.
How has that brought anxiety through the network?
Because you are the story of, shall we say, the West or the free world is now competing with other stories. And it, in some ways, competes with itself. So this idea of radical individualization, it says, I don't need anybody, I want freedom, I want autonomy, but it relies on that network.
Okay.
So you're not free from that network, but you want to be, but you need that network in order to have the freedom and autonomy that you're promised.
Sure, I see. So part of it is it brings to the fore competing narratives or cultural stories about the world.
Yeah.
So no longer is, it's separated by thousands of miles. It's brought to the door. So there's conflict. Mm-hmm. I can't escape the fact that there are other stories about the world, other peoples.
Yeah. So it's interesting because it's that centralized idea to decentralize, and you're pushing something out. But the problem with decentralizing is things can come the other way, and so ultimately, he suggests that there is anxiety in the system now. And there's a really interesting quote which basically says, as a network is swamped by chronic anxiety, it is marked by reactivity. Those within the system no longer act rationally, but rather high emotion becomes the dominant form of interaction, which we've probably seen some of that around, not just in social media, but in the mainstream media and in our interactions. And he says, the system's focus, therefore, is directed towards the most emotionally immature and reactive members. And those who are more mature and healthy begin to adapt their behaviour to appease the most irrational and unhealthy. This creates a scenario where the most emotionally unhealthy and immature members in the system become de facto leaders, shaping the emotional landscape with the focus on their negative behaviour and what they see as the negative behaviour of others. So we've been quite high end, but ultimately I think this bit was really on the nose. High end, high level. This bit was really on the nose.
High end podcast, guys.
With the idea that actually we are formed or shaped most by the most emotionally unhealthy in our groups. And probably we've seen that, we've experienced that, because in people's emotional maturity, they pander to that a little bit.
For sure.
Yes.
And I mean, yes, absolutely, we see that in the online space. But I mean, that quote, it kind of says that they become the de facto leaders, the most emotionally immature. And I think we don't even have to think very long to go. It's not just like in that space, but in our actual nations, we are becoming led by those who are not necessarily the most emotionally stable, you could say. So, yeah, wow. So we kind of painted that picture of the network, the world we live in. It's almost, become saturated by that anxiety.
And so to quickly bring this, he has that biblical lens, which is important. He uses that word stronghold. He says in many ways, the West or the free world has been the stronghold for so many people. Right. And now it's shaking with new ideas, with anxiety, with everything. And so it's like, well, in biblical language, who should our stronghold be? He talks then a lot about wildernesses. And the West's idea of the wilderness is effectively America's idea of the wilderness, which is the outback, isn't it?
Conquer.
The
Wild West.
The Wild West, isn't it? And it was like the guy goes in to the Wild West to find glory.
Right.
But that's in competition with the biblical story, which is the guy goes into the West, or someone goes into the wilderness. Jesus goes in to combat the devil, but also to realise that God is his only stronghold. Right. And you have like King David in the Old Testament, where he was the shepherd in the wilderness. And then he gets anointed to be king. But then he goes back into the wilderness because he has not formed yet enough to know that God is his only stronghold. So when he is king, for the most part, he is fully reliant on God, even though he has the armies and the treasure and all these other things.
Yeah.
And so it's a different view of the wilderness. And so ultimately, he says to be a non-anxious presence in an anxious world is fundamental. And he sets this scene, he tells this story of, imagine there's a big conference room, there's leaders at the front and everyone else is listening to this press conference. Right? Then there's a fire in the room and one of the exits is closed and everyone's starting to get anxious and panicky. And then one person from the middle of the room just walks up. She walks up to the front and she says, right, there's a fire, we need everyone to calmly stand up and lead out. Before that fire, who were the leaders? Well, they were the ones at the front. But in that situation, who was a leader? It was the non-anxious person who gave clear instructions.
Sure.
And he basically says, well, some cultural thinkers say we can just be presences of peace or non-anxiousness. He says that ultimately comes from God. And so spending time in the wilderness with God and relying on him is the way you can show up as a non-anxious presence.
Okay. So... Yeah, I think that's interesting. That idea of the West, that America's vision of what the wilderness is very different from that more ancient and Eastern really, but biblical vision of instead of going to compete and to conquer, it's more even of there's a contesting in that space, but it's a surrendering or a recognizing of I can't do this on myself.
So I found this book really helpful to understand the cultural moment. It's all a way of understanding the cultural moment that we're in globally, but also how we show up in it. Is it a book to be read by everyone? Probably not. If you are a Christian leader, I think this is probably very necessary reading to understand the place that you're working in and how that operates and how some of the traps that you can fall into. But the necessity to... move from an old style of leadership, which was known as Taylorism, ironically, and that was all about systems efficiency. So a lot of our leadership models is about you come up with the vision, you outline the vision, you plan, you execute, you do it more efficiently. That doesn't work in this networked world. That doesn't work in a complex world. You can't just strive to be more efficient because everything is shifting and there is immaturity emotionally and people are not responding to just driving more efficient programs. And so I think that was an interesting way to recognize, hey, this was an old way of understanding leadership that has worked and can, in some parts of it, probably still be of value. But now we are operating in a different environment. Yeah.
And I think also it just helps to remember, regardless of where you're coming from, I haven't read the book yet, but we all, anxiety is not something that is, what's that about? It's so loud, the noise about anxiety. It's helpful to have a high level look at where might this be coming from beyond just because of course our solutions in a highly individualistic world are, you just need to do better self-care, you need to do a little bit of time alone. It's like, well, actually, if you're surrounded in a sea of anxiety, yes, me looking after myself is going to be important, but the solution isn't just I look after myself.
Yeah, there's a system level to this, which I found helpful. Like you said, if so many people are experiencing it, something of the global system is probably pushing that out or shifting that out. So there we are. That's another episode of the Make It Count podcast. I hope you found it interesting. Maybe some of you found it high end, high level. I found it very interesting to read. And that idea of being a person who can show up in a non-anxious way, or a person at peace, I think is something I strive for, I aspire to.
Absolutely.
Right, see you next week.
I'm really a lot lower than you. You were jumping on the That's what we did last time. This is the lazy setup.
You gotta not sit back, you gotta sit up and forward.
I know.
Do you sit on these two as well?
Chuck me one.
That's the big one.
Excellent, that's fine.
We've got other stuff here you can sit on as well.
I feel like
Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast.